ist eine Realität aus Blut und Fleisch.
In one of the darkest chapters in history, the National Socialist Party, or Nazis, took control of Germany in the 1930s. They soon plunged the world into global conflict. This is the story of a brave group of Americans and their planes who fought against their evil war machine and risked their lives for freedom.
Dass die Gegner, die damals noch gelacht haben, heute auch noch lachen.
When British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and American President Franklin Roosevelt hammered out their strategy to defeat Hitler, they chose General Dwight D. Eisenhower to command the Allied forces. Although Ike was an army man, he was a leading proponent of diverting scarce resources into building up a potent air force. Eisenhower knew that the more damage dealt to the Nazis by air, the less his ground troops would suffer. In the beginning days of the war, it was the brave Air Force crews who bore the brunt of the battle. Initial losses were devastating. Because American fighter planes had short ranges, our bombers flew deep into German territory without escort. As many as 1/3 of our bombers didn't return, and those that did brought back scores of wounded and dead. But for every one of our boys who was carried off in a stretcher, a dozen more were eager to step in and pick up the fight. The battle for European air supremacy was ferocious. The master of the skies would be master of the continent, and each side threw their best and their bravest into the conflict. Arsenal America not only supplied the men, but also the materiel to first blunt the Nazi attacks and then take the war to Hitler's heartland. At first, our unprotected bombers flew in tight formations, expecting their dense firepower would protect them against the attacking fighters. The Germans suffered heavy damage, but our lumbering bombers were still sitting ducks. When the United States introduced long-range fighters, the tide of the air war turned. Not only did they protect our bombers, but the American fighters aggressively sought out their German counterparts and systematically destroyed them. Finally, the German Air Force was obliterated. The Allies unleashed wave after wave of aerial attacks on Nazi industry and military strongholds. By the time the war ended, every major German industrial center was reduced to rubble. The pounding continued around the clock, with the Americans bombing during the day and the British bombing at night. This pressure took a huge psychological as well as physical toll on the enemy. Our bombers could fly missions to Berlin and back completely unchallenged. Scenes of mass destruction were everywhere. The bombing was so intense that some cities, like Dresden, lost more people from one conventional bombing raid than were killed by the atomic explosion that decimated Hiroshima. But as long as there was Nazi resistance, our bombers kept coming. The story of how the United States turned its peacetime economy into a gigantic war machine is one of the unsung heroic tales of the war.
This is the story of Willow Run, one of the Ford farms that virtually overnight became the largest aircraft plant that had ever been built. A story that now can be told in full. Here, before our security and freedom were challenged by war, boys were learning the trade of being productive and responsible Americans. They were taught to till the land and plow a straight furrow. Guided by farm experts and aided by modern machinery, the boys at the Willow Run farm planted, grew, and harvested the finest produce. In the early spring, they tapped the sugar maples, collected the rising sap, and took it to the nearby sugar house where it was converted to maple products. Then came the threat of war. The sugar house, the maples, and the farm were sacrificed to make room for a plant designed to produce one consolidated Vultee Liberator every hour. Thousands of skilled workers were employed, pouring 100,000 yards of concrete, erecting 38,000 tons of structural steel, setting 10 million bricks, fitting miles of piping, and running more miles of electric cable to operate the thousands of machines that were to be installed in this truly giant structure. The Army Air Forces asked Ford to undertake mass production of this bomber, in addition to other aerial weapons produced by the company, which included troop-carrying gliders, turbo superchargers, and the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney aircraft engine. This 80-acre plant was built in record time. In reality, it was made into two plants under one roof, a manufacturing plant and an assembly plant. The now famous Willow Run Airfield covers 1,434 acres and provides 280 acres of concrete runways and taxi strips, enough to make a two-lane concrete highway 120 miles long. And this was Willow Run's product, a giant flying machine for which the plant was so carefully tuned that it could produce one every 55 minutes. This is the Army Air Force's Liberator Heavy Bomber, the ship that made headlines and was affectionately known among flyers as the Limb. This great aircraft is 110 feet from wingtip to wingtip and 67 feet 4 inches from nose to tail. Powered by four 1,200 horsepower air-cooled engines, the Lib can carry 10 men, 4 tons of bombs, and 5,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition at better than 300 miles per hour at high altitude. The B-24, as it is officially designated, can fly 3,000 miles non-stop. And as the pilot signals the control tower and prepares to bring her down, we will soon see for ourselves how this modern miracle of mass production has been performed. Okayed by the tower and lined up with the runway, we are bringing in 20 tons of bomber at better than 100 miles per hour. On solid concrete. The pilot again calls the control tower and is assigned a position on the apron. And as we taxi to this berth, we pass just part of a day's production waiting to be tested by Ford pilots. Wave our pilot to his position, and we are grounded at fabulous Willow Run. At the entrance to the administration building, 1 mile away from the landing apron at the other end of the plant, this plaque proves that the Army Air Forces and Ford were ready when war came. Dedicated June 16, 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. In offices of the Army Air Forces and in that of the Ford superintendent, a close check was kept on the movement of all bomber assembly lines with this master board. Numbered, movable models show the step-by-step progress of the nearly 100 bombers which were always progressing down through the plant assembly lines. People flooded in the gates of Willow Run summer and winter, by day and by night. At one time, 42,000 of them. They made up the ranks of the bomber plant's production force. To teach these workers how, a $500,000 school was built adjoining the plant. More than 50,000 workers were graduated in from 1 to 10 subjects by this school organization. To do this vital job, Ford had to provide hundreds of instructors to teach more than 50 courses. Workers learned about the complicated aircraft hydraulic system and the mysteries of aircraft electronics. Cutaway engines served to illustrate installation and service details. Bomber and hour production made necessary the erection of a detached warehouse covering 11 acres to house and handle raw materials. In this vast space, 785 totally different items were stored. There were enough materials here and in the plant at one time to build 1,000 liberators. Here you would find sheet aluminum, aluminum bars, coiled aluminum wire, and virtually every other known form of this lightweight metal. For 85% of a liberator's 20 tons is aluminum. This was the first step of construction. Aluminum sheets were cut into proper sizes for handling in the plant's presses and forming machines, such as this great battery of presses which stamped out parts for the B-24. Some of these, the same presses Ford uses to make bodies and fenders for automobiles, were loaned to Willow Run. Because of the great variety of parts that go into a bomber, nearly 15,000 dies had to be constantly rotated through these presses to maintain a sufficient stock of parts on hand. Before these aluminum sheets were fed into presses, they had to be sprayed with a lubricant to prevent scratching and to help the metal flow in the dies. In this operation, 3 presses are seen shaping a wing bulkhead. Because of the wing taper, 57 different shaped and sized bulkheads were made for each wing. These presses soon produced enough of this size for many ships, after which the dies had to be changed. So the die changing operation went on continuously. Since these planes were to be flown over salt water, in the tropics, far north, all over the world, individual parts had to be treated to protect them from the elements. Wrecks like these dip 52,000 shining pieces, plus 4.5 tons of rivets every working day. And speaking of rivets, 400,000 went into every liberator, and these too were produced at Willow Run. This plant produced more than 400 sizes and 13 varieties of rivets, carefully checked by inspectors. In sharp contrast to small rivets are these 250-pound landing wheels shipped in, ready to install. Just a tube of this tire weighs more than the complete tire and tube on the average family car. The wings and fuselage took thousands of feet of stringers, the ribs of the body, and these were shaped on miniature rolling mills such as this. Each roller adds a bend in the stripped aluminum. Then the length is sliced off. After treating, stringers went to punch presses, where as many as 312 holes were punched with one stroke, through which rivets later held the aluminum skin. Practically everything in a bomber had to be curved in one direction or another. The revolving action of the die bends the metal to the needed shape. This peculiar-looking operation was typical of many at Willow Run. At this station, heavy stock was rolled into a circular track for a power gun turret. And this later was machined to fine tolerances so that the guns could swing smoothly and swiftly in combat action. Aluminum tubes made up the arteries of the lib. These tubes carried gasoline, oil, hydraulic fluid, oxygen, compressed air, fire extinguishing fluids, steam, de-icing solution, screening smoke, and antifreeze to various parts of the ship. More than 1,700 different tubes were installed in each B-24 to feed the 12 different control systems. Straight pieces of tubing were cut, bent carefully, flanged, degreased, treated to prevent corrosion, prepared with proper fittings, and inspected. Each was identified with colored tape. Instead of putting individual tubes into the bomber, Ford's mass assembly technique called for making them up into clusters, which were made in special jigs and fitted into the bomber and entire units. And here you see workers assembling the pre-bent tubes into one assembly unit. These clusters, assembled with other sections, made up the bomber's complicated plumbing system. Basically, Willow Run's manufacturing system was like that of the Ford automobile plants. This was the key to the secret of building one bomber every hour. This chart shows how Ford production men cut up the Liberator into major assembly sections. 1, the center wing. 2, the nose. 3, the aft fuselage. 4, the engines. 5, the tail. And 6, the outer wings. And these were handled very much like automobile assembly lines, where cars are also divided into major components: the frame, the engine, the wheels, and the body, all mated on the final assembly line. Like the automobile, this bomber started with small parts being fastened together, such as by spot welding. There are no sparks in spot welding, the metals being fused by pressure and an electrical charge. This welder makes 300 spot welds a minute, so close together that they make a leak-proof seam. Applied to aircraft manufacture, Ford's spot welding technique saved 35,000 man-hours of labor per month and replaced 15,000 relatively heavy rivets in every bomber. Parts that do not lend themselves to other methods of assembly were welded by gas, and here these men and women use gas torches to join parts. Gas welding of aluminum is a highly specialized job, and scores of welders were trained in the Willow Run School. Plenty of special tools like this pressure riveter were designed for use in this work. Small assemblies for planes required much handwork, as demonstrated by this use of an air drill on one assembly phase of the tail turret well, and more dramatically shown by the building of the pilot's control column. Because of the relatively few units required to meet bomber and hour production, it would not have been practical to devise a moving conveyor line for such assembly operations as these. Assembly work was, of course, simplified by precision machining operations, by which formed and cast parts were shaved down almost to perfection with allowable tolerances running from only 1/2 of 1,000th of an inch to 15 thousandths. Among the small sub-assemblies, some of the more interesting originate in the plexiglass section, where windows of strange shapes were made of this light plastic. After being soaked at 256 degrees, transparent plastic becomes flexible and can be readily shaped to needed patterns. After cooling, this particular piece becomes part of the bombardier's enclosure for the nose of the ship. In this solution, it required a protective coating to prevent scratching during handling. This coating was removed later. And here workers are shown fastening aluminum skin to a stringer assembly to make the most important part of the bomber, the center wing section. Like the frame of an automobile, the center wing is the backbone of the Liberator. It carries the load of the 4 engines, the gasoline tanks, the bombs, the fuselage, and the landing gear. The spar is the main beam that runs the entire length of the center wing. The whole wing is built around it. By breaking the center wing down into sub-assemblies and by using mass production fixtures such as these, Ford cut the cycle time for building wings from 19 days to a matter of hours, from 11,414 man-hours of labor to just a few hundred. When the sub-assemblies were completed, they were swung by crane to big 27-ton vertical fixtures, the massiveness of which ensured rigidity. After the spars were in place at the bottom, bulkhead and stringer assemblies were lowered and fastened together to form the main structure of the wing. Aluminum skin was then riveted to the outside, and another center wing assembly was completed. The completely assembled wing section then moved off through the air to the next operation. Originally faced with the possibility of a bottleneck in the machining and milling of such a large section as this wing, Ford engineers borrowed an idea which they had used for many years in making automobiles. They designed a brand new machine shop combine known as the final machining unit. While the wing was held firmly in position, it was attacked from all directions by drills and milling tools. Illustration is offered by this multiple drill used to machine Ford V8 engine blocks at the Rouge plant. Note that the drills come in from all angles and drill many holes at one time. So it is with the final machining unit. Many machine operations were performed at the same time and in exactly the same position on every wing. This illustrates why every part of every Ford-built Liberator is exactly like every similar part, and shows why these parts have been interchangeable from ship to ship all over the world. Cranes fed the completely machined wings to twin furnishing lines, each of which was about a city block long. Here, women workers began installation of the incredibly complicated wing wiring system. Also, the tubing clusters you saw being assembled in another part of the plant. And the 4 turbo superchargers, actually turbine pumps, which force air to the 4 engines, increasing horsepower and enabling the ship to fly higher where the atmosphere is thin. These superchargers are exhaust-driven turbines, the rotors of which speed up to an incredible 26,000 revolutions per minute. The landing gear was installed here, hooked up to its controls and tested to be sure it retracted. And so we now see the center wing section, the chassis of the bomber, completely assembled and on its way to the 4 final assembly lines. It is ready for mating to the other main sections of the bomber, which have been assembled in other parts of the vast plant. The nose section was next with its vital flight instruments, cabin for pilots, radio man, flight engineer, navigator, and bombardier. This section is the nerve center of the ship. The nose section started out with this ribbing in which the woman worker is installing a window frame. Aluminum skin then could be riveted to this ribbing to form the outer wall. Side panels for the nose, consisting of more than 500 structural parts, were attached to a conveyor and moved along an assembly line. Each of these women workers had a certain job to do in furnishing this wall with its necessary equipment, including more than 1,000 different parts. This method of assembly saved time and money because this work would take much longer if done in the limited quarters of the bomber after assembly. Here on these assembly lines, the workers could do their job quickly and easily. The pilot's floor, controls, and instrument panel was put together on a 400-foot merry-go-round type of assembly line, which revolved very slowly and which consisted of 30 stations. This obviously very intricate and complicated assembly job consisted of 190 separate installations, each of which had to be a sub-assembly with a maze of detail within itself. Complete with its surrounding framework, the pilot's floor was then lowered into a special mating fixture. A crane then brought the complete side walls over to the fixture and placed them in position. This wall was furnished with a great deal of equipment, including an electrical harness consisting of more than a half-mile of cable. This fixture was so built that both side walls could be slid over against the framework that supported them. Then the entire unit was fastened. The cabin roof came next, followed by the canopy, called the greenhouse by flyers. Workers could then finish mating the tubes, wires, and installing other nose furnishings. Next step in assembling a Liberator at Willow Run was building the tail part of the fuselage. These boat-like objects are aft bottom panels. The ribbing was held in place by fixtures, while workers applied the skin. After which the panels were turned over and furnished on this moving assembly line. In the meantime, the tail cone had been made, and its furnishings are here shown being completed on this line. Tail section side panels were joined together to form the top and sides of the aft fuselage, seen here as it is being lowered to meet its bottom panel. This worker is hooking up the oxygen system which supplies the life-sustaining gas to members of the crew when the bomber is flying at high altitudes. The complete assembly, all of the fuselage aft to the wing, was then lifted and carried to a 15-station moving assembly line where the remainder of its furnishings were installed. Throughout all these processes, company inspectors, one for every 13 workers, ensured that these bomber components were well made and ready for assembly. Meanwhile, the center wing section had been moved on to one of the 4 assembly lines, which in the end narrowed to 2. As the bomb racks, catwalk, and bomb bay sides go in, you can see the fuselage take shape where it connects with the center wing. At this point, the nose section and the aft section of the fuselage were fed into the final assembly lines by being lifted to an overhead conveyor which brought them to the proper spot for mating with the center wing. The first major section, the nose, was lowered to the assembly line where a cradle was used to slide it backward for connection with the wing. Next came the aft fuselage section. When the wing and this section were mated, it really began to look like a bomber. The gun turret in the bomber's nose was quickly installed. Then came engine installation. All 4 went on at one station, one after the other. With cowling and accessories all attached, one of the 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines was carefully lowered into position and attached to its mounting in the wing. Each engine was fastened in place in 15 minutes, but of course, added time was needed to hook up their controls as the ship progressed down the line. Only 4 bolts hold the engine to the wing, and each of these is a mere 5/8 of an inch in diameter. As engines were installed, The great twin tail made in the Ford Rouge plant and assembled at Willow Run was swung down by a crane to its proper points on the fuselage. Made to fit with precision, the actual fastening of this unit required only a matter of minutes. But after the tail was attached, all of the controls leading to the elevators and rudders had to be hooked up so the plane could be controlled in the air. Then another business unit of the bomber went into place, the top turret. Notice that the bomber then no longer rode down through the plant on conveyors. It rolled on its own giant wheels. At this point, too, the great bird was ready to extend its wings. The bomber stopped on a floor conveyor and was slid sidewise to the middle of the bay. Note the little midget who will get inside the main wing to fasten the outer wing to the center section as it swings into position. The same action took place on the other side of the ship as well, and with both outer wings in place. The complete span is 110 feet from tip to tip. A few finishing touches remained as the bomber continued to move on a faster schedule since all of the large assemblies were in place. The insignia was painted on. Delicate instruments, radio equipment, wing flaps, soundproofing, and propellers quickly were added in this station-to-station progress. Here the 4,200 square feet of bomber skin was cleaned. The woman worker polishes the bombardier's window. There is enough aluminum here to fabricate 55,000 coffee percolators, and it's quite a cleaning job. Back in 1941, it was believed impossible to build a bomber as big as the Liberator in an hour. In fact, in several hours. Even the conception of a plant such as this was viewed with considerable skepticism. But the people at Ford have vision as well as skill. They have always planned and worked on a broad scale, have always struck out on pioneering paths, and they're wise in the ways of mass production. Of course, this was something new in assembly, not just another relatively simple automobile with only 15,000 or so parts to be made and assembled. Each of these machines is made up of 1,225,000 parts, and each had to be perfect. And in these lines, you see the evidence of another Ford-made miracle. The Willow Run bomber plant has furnished one of the miracle production stories of this war. It produced 8,685 bombers in a steady stream, relentless, unceasing, on time, as methodical as a great river fed by its tributaries. These ships are the product of experience. Constant changes, some dictated by service conditions, have given to the Army Air Force's bombers that fly farther, faster, and higher, with the result that the final marbles look far different than their older cousins. After the ship was built, Ford's job was not yet done, because each ship, each of the thousands made at Willow Run, had to be thoroughly tested by both ground and flight crews. .50-caliber machine guns were fired, and steel bullets buried themselves in the sandpit. Engines were revved up to takeoff speed. In some, dummy bombs were loaded to test the racks. But in all the planes, hours and hours were spent in tests and checks by specially trained ground crews before functional tests aloft. From Flight Operations Center, 4-man test crews took over. These crews consisted of pilot, co-pilot, radio man, and flight engineer. A touch on the hydraulic button, and the bomb bay door opens to give access to the ship. Engines start. And she taxis out to the runway for her first flight. The big ship gathers speed rapidly, racing down the runway for a full power takeoff. We're airborne and the wheels are retracted into their wing well. In the air, the belly turret is lowered and tested. Each of the 4 propellers is fully feathered. When the pilot readjusts the blades, the rush of wind will again start the engine. Bomb bay doors are open and closed. The flight engineer checks performance of the engines and equipment, including the inner communication system, after which the bomb bay doors are open again, and the dummy bombs are away. Test completed, our ship peels off. This ship is strong, with strength built in by skilled brains and hands, with all the experience that Ford has gained over the years of mass production. For the Army Air Forces, it has strength to fly and fight, and return to fly and fight again and again and again. That is its contribution to winning a peace. So out of the pain and fury of war has arisen the beginning of a means of rapid transport to the farthest places in the world.
The B-24s were one of the great workhorses of the war. They were seemingly indestructible, and their crews and America developed a deep affection for the great bomber that was called the Liberator. For the men who flew them, the planes took on their own personalities. The artwork that decorated each plane showed that in times of dire struggle, the flyers kept their sense of humor.
Yes, good humor, come what may.
Now, let's witness what it was like to participate in a major bombing mission where danger was a fact of life.
The 15th Air Force soon got the news. They had been ordered to fly through Hitler's back door and destroy his oil industry. General Twining and his staff took on the job.
Gentlemen, you've just received a directive establishing target priority for bomber offensive for 15th Air Force. The decision has been announced. We will destroy oil refineries and synthetic oil plants. Now, Colonel Young, what does our intelligence show us in regard to these targets within our area?
More than 50% of the refineries and synthetic plants producing gasoline for the Axis are within range of the 15th Air Force. Between 25 and 30% of the total Axis production of gasoline is represented by the 10 large refineries around Ploesti. While these refineries were seriously damaged in the attack last August by the task force operating from Egypt, recent photo reconnaissance reveals that, with one exception, all refineries are currently operating at full capacity.
General Hubert Cotton, it's a big job we've got ahead.
The knockout of Ploesti means the German will be deprived
Of 1/3 of his oil resources.
We bomber boys who moved up from Africa started the Ploesti air siege. On the morning of April 5th, 94, B-17 swung into formation. Close by were 136 B-24s. We were strong. We expected the enemy's coastal radar network in Albania and Yugoslavia to spot us as we made our approach over the Adriatic Sea. Although it was still early in our 600-mile run to target, we got into flak suits. They're a kind of insurance. Climbing to altitude, we skimmed the Yugoslav mountains. Mighty peaceful. Peaceful until they bristled with flak guns. We were soon to find out the hard way that Ploesti had become the third best defended spot on the continent. This was a high-altitude mission, 21 to 24,000 feet. As we neared the target, we edged into tighter formations. Each had top cover. We all remembered a 1943 Ploesti mission with 177 liberators in which we lost 54 planes. Would this be like last year's mission? This one might be worse. 250 enemy fighters, outnumbering ours 3 to 1, attacked. Fighters almost had enough. By the time we crossed the Sofia-Belgrade line, our lightnings moved in for the knockout punch. Then we ran into flak. 256 heavy guns filled the sky with black, deadly mushrooms. Intense flak, the enemy had added smoke. We could almost smell the nauseating acid fog. 2,000 smoke pots effectively covered Ploesti. Accurate visual bombing was impossible.
The job wasn't done. Operations increased. Servicing went around the clock. The plan called for the bombers to be on target during the morning hours and stop Ploesti's working day. Now they prepared for 600 plane missions. They tried new electronic devices for blind bombing. Everyone hoped the sheer concentrated weight of tonnage would crack German and Romanian defenses. Ploesti sort of got under everyone's skin. After hitting it from the air, the flyers rehashed it on the ground. The men ate it, slept it, cursed it, especially the flak and smoke. The 4-month campaign since April had cost 1,900 men, the crews of 189 bombers and 41 fighters.
Early in August, General Twining called a meeting of our group commanders.
This strategic air force, during the next 3 days, will attack continuously, night and day, with maximum effort against all refineries in the area.
We got over Ploesti, all right, but the enemy gave us a warm welcome. They rammed up more than 45,000 rounds of flak. That didn't stop us. During 3 days of smoky air siege, we lost 30 more planes, 23 to flak. But now we had over 100 Mustangs as escorts. The enemy jabbed, and our 51 swooped into the battle. Hit hard, enemy fighter strength fell apart. Displaying courage far beyond the call of duty, our boys drove the enemy into the ground.
Ploeszty was almost completely destroyed, and with it went almost a third of Hitler's capacity to produce oil. But Ploeszty wasn't the only industrial complex that was crushed by Allied bombers. Despite heavy casualties, no place on the continent was safe from the terror our flyers poured down from the skies.
This is a global war, and its character is nowhere better demonstrated than in the worldwide range of our targets.
Out of the aircraft factories of the United States roll the planes to smash at the Axis wherever it is entrenched. On the Army Air Force's Team 2 are the men and women on the production line. Men and women determined to maintain the high quality of their workmanship, determined to get this war over. There is no enemy fortress anywhere on this globe that cannot be reached and blasted by the planes they build.
Nauru is an island held by the Japs, a valuable phosphate producer 1,000 miles from Hawaii.
Talking it over after the briefing. On the way. Sighting Nauru. Bombs away. Mission accomplished at a price.
American bombers helped smash the Mareth Line.
Bombs away. Bombs away.
Rabaul on the island of New Britain, a key Jap base.
Bombs away. Bombs away.
Kiska, the last Jap barrier on the island bridge to Asia.
Bombs away. Gunning for Jap interceptor planes. Straight shooting. Strafing. Second flight. Bombs away.
Pantelleria, unconditional surrender to air power alone.
Bombs away.
The not-so-soft underbelly.
Over Seuss Harbor. Bombs away. Over Messina. Bombs away. Over Sicily. Bombs away. Return engagement over Messina. Bombs away. Over the Italian mainland. Incendiaries.
Our bombing raids were extremely effective in destroying Axis military targets. But the air victory cost us dearly, both in terms of materiel and men. Our bomber crews are indebted to our fighter planes, their little friends who bravely engaged the best the Luftwaffe had to offer and destroyed them.
Planes known as the P-47, the Thunderbolt, a fast, tough, high-altitude fighter with a dive like its name and an 8-gun blast in its wings. The Lightning, the P-38, master of the air in many theaters of war with its long range and concentrated firepower. The Mustang, the P-51, the longest range fighter in the world. Speed, fast climb, quick dive, tight turn. Into these three great fighters, America poured its genius, its millions of man-hours of labor, its faith in victory against the Luftwaffe. And in their single cockpits, it placed these men. The Germans see them deep in their own sky and cringe. Our men see them above the grim fight and cheer. There are remembered names in the mess halls. Major Gerald Johnson, a crack shot. Major Goodson, gallant fighter. Major Dwayne Beeson, great tactician. Captain Eugene O'Neill, one of the best. Major Don Gentili ran up a flaming record. Colonel Don Blakesley, great leader of 4th Group. Major Walker Mahurin, one of the first and best of the great aces. Major Bob Johnson and all his victories. Lieutenant Colonel Gabreski with a great career. And Colonel Hubert Zemke, famous commander of 56. A score of victories or more on the records of them all. Duncan, Schilling, Pretty, and all our gallant fighter pilots who in the decisive hour smashed the Luftwaffe and gave us freedom of the air in Europe.